The ground trembles beneath thousands of armored feet. In the distance, a storm of dust rises, blotting out the sun as the full weight of a Roman legion advances. A world is on the edge of collapse. The mighty Roman Empire, unmatched in its military might, stretching its dominance from Spain to Syria, now faces a force unlike any it has ever encountered. A force led by a man whose name strikes fear into the heart of the empire. Hannibal Barca. Against all odds, he stands poised to shatter Rome's invincible facade. The distance between victory and utter annihilation is measured in blood, sand, and steel. One man, his army, and a relentless will to make history bend to his vision. But this war, this conflict, this fight was never meant to be won. It begins in the shadow of the Alps, a cold, unforgiving range where the winds whip through craggy peaks and the ground is slick with snow and ice. The mountains are a natural barrier, a fortress carved into the very bones of the earth. No army, they say, has ever crossed them. But Hannibal is not here to obey the laws of nature. In the year 218 before Common Era, Hannibal Barca did what no one believed could be done. He led an army across these frozen heights, a feat of engineering and human endurance so daring, it nearly defied belief. 6,000 horses, tens of thousands of soldiers, each one weakened by hunger, frostbite, and the sheer brutality of the mountain's grasp, pushed forward with a single purpose: to bring war to the heart of Rome. There was no retreat, no backdoor escape. If this failed, every man, every woman, and every child in his army would perish. But Hannibal knew this. It was a chance, a gamble so dangerous that even the greatest minds of the time could only look on in horror. He had no choice but to move forward. Behind him, the legions of Rome had no idea what was coming. The forces of Rome, swollen by centuries of conquest, have never faced anything like this. Their armies are endless, trained, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the empire that birthed them. They are accustomed to winning. Their strategy has never known defeat. But there is a hole in their perception, an arrogance born from years of unstoppable victories. They underestimated their enemy. And as the Roman Republic lurches forward, ready to crush this audacious rebel, Hannibal stands at the precipice of greatness, the taste of Rome's fall on his lips. Hannibal's march into Italy began with fire. His army cut through the Mediterranean, crossing the treacherous terrain of the Alps and invading the lands of the Republic. As he reached the plains of northern Italy, the Romans knew they were facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. Rome's response was swift. Every general, every centurion, every senator called for vengeance. The Republic's might would not be tested by this Carthaginian threat. Soon, Hannibal would be met by the full force of Rome's military, 2 full legions, at least 40,000 men, ready to crush the invaders. Their first battle would determine everything. On the day of the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal's army was outnumbered nearly 2-1. Rome, believing its superiority would be enough to win the day, marched confidently into the field. Yet, on that day, the gods would smile upon Hannibal's tactical genius. In an act that left Roman generals speechless, Hannibal lured the Romans into a trap. The Carthaginian army, hiding in the riverbanks, ambushed the advancing Romans from both sides. As the blood of thousands mixed with the mud of the battlefield, Rome's finest soldiers fell one by one. When the battle was over, the Romans had lost more than half their forces. But this was only the beginning. Hannibal had already begun to sow the seeds of fear within the Roman heart. His military genius had turned the tide of battle, and his name would echo through history as a symbol of military brilliance. Rome, for the first time, could not guarantee its victory. They were forced to adapt, but adaptation in the face of Hannibal's strategy was not a guarantee of survival. Rome, in its overconfidence, made one fatal mistake after another. Instead of confronting Hannibal head-on, they chose to fight him on his terms. They underestimated the force of the Carthaginian commander's mind, and so, one after another, the Roman legions were shattered in battles they never expected to lose. The next blow came at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal, having lured the Romans into a narrow pass, encircled them in an inferno of death. The Romans were utterly destroyed. The aftermath of this battle was nothing short of catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead, their bodies strewn across the battlefield like broken toys, shattered by the unstoppable force of Hannibal's tactical brilliance. But as the dust settled and the echoes of war faded, the situation in Rome had only grown worse. The Senate, terrified and unable to find a solution, began to panic. The Republic's ability to continue the fight was becoming more and more tenuous by the day. Their armies were stretched thin, their resources dwindling, and the morale of the Roman people was faltering. Yet, despite the staggering series of defeats, the Republic refused to surrender. It was an empire built on the belief that victory was their birthright. And Hannibal, relentless and full of fire, continued his march through Italy, carving a path of destruction. The future of Rome was uncertain. Would this rebellious general, with his army of warriors, be the one to bring about the fall of an empire? But even in the heart of his success, there were cracks. Hannibal's genius was undeniable. His victories were unmatched, but something darker was lurking. The war he fought was not only against Rome. He was fighting against time, against the internal rot that had begun to fester in his own ranks. As the Carthaginian forces ransacked city after city, the Senate in Carthage began to look on with increasing suspicion. Internal politics, the very force Hannibal had hoped to avoid, were threatening to unravel his great campaign. Carthage's support, vital for Hannibal's success, began to wane. And as the months turned into years, the hope of victory began to dim. The cost of war was growing heavier. And for all of Hannibal's brilliance, his position was precarious. Could he maintain his momentum with Rome closing in? Would the victories that once seemed so certain ultimately lead to his undoing? In the year 216 before Common Era, the Romans finally decided to confront Hannibal head-on at the Battle of Cannae. The stakes could not have been higher. The battle, which would come to be known as one of the bloodiest in ancient history, became a defining moment in the Second Punic War. Hannibal, despite his dwindling resources, would face the full force of the Roman legions. But Hannibal, once again, turned what should have been a suicidal conflict into an overwhelming victory. Using his signature tactics, feigning retreat, drawing the Romans in, and then surrounding them, Hannibal executed the perfect pincer movement. The Roman legions, unable to respond quickly enough, were surrounded on all sides. Trapped, disoriented, and outnumbered, they were massacred in what can only be described as a slaughter. Nearly 70,000 Romans were killed that day. It was a victory so complete, so utterly devastating, that it became etched into the annals of history as one of the most brilliant military strategies ever conceived. Hannibal, the master tactician, had once again demonstrated his unrivaled genius. Rome was on the brink of collapse. But, as always, the question remained, for how long could he hold on? Hannibal's victories, though impressive, had come at a grave cost. His army, although victorious on the battlefield, was starving, demoralized, and increasingly fragmented. The Carthaginian war machine, once a towering force, now limped forward on the strength of one man's will. His victories over Rome had shaken the foundations of the Republic, but the real cost of war was beginning to weigh heavily on his shoulders. As the battle-hardened general surveyed the bloody aftermath of Cannae, a somber thought crossed his mind. He had achieved what few could even dream of. He had broken the Roman legions. But victory came with its own kind of curse. The Romans, unable to surrender, would fight to the bitter end. And despite his brilliance, despite the blood that had been spilled, the path to true victory remained just beyond his grasp. But in the depths of his triumph, there was an even darker twist waiting. The victory at Cannae, the bloodiest and most decisive of his career, would become a bittersweet moment in the grand arc of Hannibal's campaign. Rome, though crushed, would not break. They would not bend. And as Hannibal continued his march across Italy, a new, unforeseen threat began to emerge. The very generals who had once admired his genius were now beginning to question whether the cost of victory was worth it. Would his brilliance, so bright on the battlefield, burn out before Rome could be finished? Hannibal's ultimate undoing would not come from the edge of a sword or the might of an opposing army. It would come from something far more insidious, the collapse of support from Carthage itself. The Senate's faith in Hannibal would wane, and with it, so too would the resources that fueled his campaign. The man who had crossed the Alps, who had turned the tide of battle with a mere handful of soldiers, would find himself slowly abandoned, alone against the full might of Rome's response. Hannibal's brilliance was unparalleled, but in the end, it was not enough to break the iron will of Rome. His greatest victories became his greatest burdens, and the path that once seemed to lead to Rome's destruction now became a dark and empty road toward an inevitable defeat. The legacy of Hannibal Barca remains one of the greatest stories ever told, not of victory, but of what happens when the best laid plans are undone by politics, betrayal, and the crushing weight of time. In the end, the fall of Rome would not come at the hands of this great general, but through the slow, unrelenting pressure of a republic that would never surrender.